Nothing frightened his enemies more than certainty, and nothing frightened those closest to Shaka more than the possibility that his certainty had no limits. By now, the Zulu kingdom was no longer a small clan struggling for recognition. It had become a force that reshaped southern Africa. Warriors moved with astonishing discipline. Chiefs measured every decision against the reality of Zulu power, and Shaka's name traveled farther than any messenger could ride. To some, he was a genius. To others, a storm in human form. But to the people who stood near him every day, he was something more complicated. A leader forged by suffering, brilliant beyond dispute, and increasingly difficult to predict. The victories continued. Rival chiefdoms fell or submitted. Cattle filled the royal enclosures, and new regiments swore loyalty to the king. Each triumph strengthened the kingdom, yet each triumph also strengthened the emotional intensity that had always lived inside him. Shaka did not experience power as comfort. He experienced it as responsibility, and responsibility, in his mind, demanded absolute discipline. Small failures were treated as dangerous warnings, hesitation became a threat, and disloyalty, real or suspected, was not tolerated. This approach made his state extraordinarily effective. It also created fear. Fear can unify people for a time, but it changes the atmosphere around a leader. Honest advice becomes rarer. Silence becomes more common, and the line between respect and anxiety begins to disappear. Still, many remained fiercely devoted to him, because they had seen what he built. They had watched a rejected outsider transform weakness into one of the most powerful military systems in African history. They believed he was chosen for something larger than ordinary rule, and in many ways they were right. Shaka was changing not just the fate of the Zulu, but the political map of the region itself. Communities moved, alliances shifted, and entire populations were forced to reconsider how they would survive in a rapidly changing world. Historians would later debate the scale and causes of these upheavals, but for the people living through them, the experience was immediate and personal. Uncertainty traveled with every rumor. Yet at the center of this transformation stood one constant figure, Shaka, unyielding, intense, and increasingly isolated by the very power he had created. And then, the one person who had known him before power, before armies, before fear, began to fade. Nandi, his mother. The woman who endured rejection beside him, the woman who taught him pride when the world offered humiliation, the woman whose strength helped shape his own. Her presence had always anchored him. Others saw the king, she saw the boy. When she became ill, the emotional foundation beneath him began to tremble. No battle had prepared him for this. He could defeat rival armies, outmaneuver chiefs, reorganize nations, but he could not command life to remain. As her condition worsened, the atmosphere around the royal court changed. Concern spread quietly. Those closest to him understood the depth of their bond. They knew that if she were lost, something inside the king might break in ways no enemy had ever achieved. And then the moment came. Nandi died. History records many great battles, but some of the most decisive moments happen in silence. For Shaka, the loss was immeasurable. The person who carried his earliest pain and his earliest hope was gone. The one witness to every humiliation of childhood had disappeared, and grief entered his life with overwhelming force. He mourned not as a ruler following custom, but as a son confronting the collapse of his emotional center of the world. The kingdom felt the impact immediately. His sorrow was profound, and his expectations reflected the intensity of that sorrow. Accounts describe a period of extraordinary mourning, with severe demands placed upon the population.
Some details in historical traditions are difficult to verify precisely, but the underlying truth remains clear. The grief was immense, and its effects were far-reaching. For Shaka, mourning was not a private emotion, it became a national experience. When leaders feel deeply, entire societies can be drawn into their inner world. The same emotional force that had built his kingdom now shaped the kingdom's suffering. To understand this period, it is important to see both sides. This was a man who genuinely loved his mother and whose identity was inseparable from their shared struggle. It was also a ruler whose immense authority meant that personal grief could become public hardship. Greatness and vulnerability often coexist. The stronger the leader, the greater the consequences when pain overwhelms restraint. As months passed, some began noticing changes. The intensity that once produced disciplined innovation now sometimes expressed itself as suspicion and unpredictability. The court grew more cautious. Trusted advisors measured their words carefully. Even loyal supporters felt the emotional distance widening. Power had always isolated him to some extent. Now grief deepened that isolation. And isolation can distort perception. When a leader carries unresolved pain, every uncertainty can appear larger than it is. Every disagreement can feel like betrayal. Every sign of weakness can seem intolerable. Yet, despite these changes, his achievements remained undeniable. The Zulu state he created continued functioning with extraordinary organization. Military structures, administrative systems, and a sense of collective identity endured. His influence extended far beyond his own lifetime. But history rarely allows human beings to remain suspended at the peak forever. The same qualities that elevate someone can also generate the conditions of decline. Around him, concern quietly increased. Some of his closest relatives and advisors began asking questions they would never speak openly. Could the kingdom continue if the king's emotional intensity grew unchecked? Could loyalty alone protect them from his shifting moods? Could the empire he built survive the force of the man who created it? These were dangerous thoughts. But power always produces them eventually, particularly when a leader appears unstoppable. Among those closest to him were his half-brothers Dingane and Mlangana. They had lived in the shadow of his rise. They understood his brilliance. They also understood his capacity for severity. Over time, fear and ambition began mixing in ways that history has seen many times before. Because when one figure dominates completely, succession becomes not merely political, it becomes existential. Those who stand nearest the throne often ask themselves the most difficult question of all. What happens if the ruler never loosens his grip? Meanwhile, Shaka remained focused on control. He had spent a lifetime building order from humiliation. Letting go was not natural to him. Every instinct urged vigilance, discipline, and decisive action. But no leader, however extraordinary, can control all forces around him. Time changes people, grief changes people, and fear changes the behavior of those who once seemed unquestionably loyal. The boy who had been mocked had achieved what few human beings ever do. He transformed suffering into statecraft, rejection into military innovation, and personal pain into national power. Yet the very intensity that fueled that transformation now cast a longer and darker shadow. His enemies outside the kingdom had largely failed to defeat him, but history was moving toward a more intimate danger. One that did not approach with opposing armies or visible battle lines. One that grew quietly among familiar faces. The kind of danger he understood all too well. Betrayal. And just as with other great figures in history, the question was no longer whether he had become powerful. The question was whether the power he created had left room for trust. because no matter how strong a king becomes, the greatest threat is often the one standing closest.